Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be looking now at the what comes next after all of the arguing and the debating and the scheming and the dealing and the compromising and all of those things, which the delegates in Philadelphia did all throughout the summer of 1787. Now the real fight begins, or now rather another fight begins. Another argument now builds and progresses as the states now become the battleground. Because just because they have now written this constitution, that doesn't mean it automatically goes into effect. And so now it becomes a battle to get enough of the states to approve of this new constitution so that it can be officially adopted and then go into effect. And we call this the ratification process. So that's why we're looking at ratifying the constitution. To ratify means to approve. That is the fancy legal word for formal approval. And the ratification process is now what begins. One of the last things that the delegates agree to is how that process is going to go. They ask the states to call together a ratification convention. They want them to call together a separate convention of their own to discuss whether or not to approve, ratify, or not to ratify, to reject the Constitution. And they cleverly asked the states to do that, to form these separate ratification conventions that were separate from the existing state governments, because they feared that those existing state governments would automatically reject the Constitution, seeing as how the Constitution was going to take away significant powers from those state governments. So they bypassed that and asked states to form separate new conventions to ratify the Constitution. And in some places, ratification will be very, very easy. There are some states, like Delaware, for example, that pretty much just ratify the Constitution almost right off the bat without too much arguing about it. But in other states, it's going to be much tougher. And particularly once you get down to the point where, you only need a few more states in order for it to go into effect, that's when it really gets, crunchy. Where it really gets heated, because not every state has to approve, but 9 of 13 do. So when they get down to where they've got like 7, 8 states have approved and they're down to just a few more, that's when it really starts to get tough. And so naturally, two sides start to develop here between those that supported the Constitution and those that did not. So we're going to look at those two sides of the argument and what each of those sides believed and how they went about trying to either get the Constitution approved and get more support for their side, or how they tried to campaign against the Constitution. So the two sides that begin to form are called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which sounds pretty simple. The Federalists, these are those people that supported the Constitution. They are in favor of the new Constitution and are arguing for its ratification and are campaigning and supportive of the states and trying to get states to say yes to this new Constitution. They get the name Federalist because, if you remember, federal means national. The central government's a reference to that. But since the Federalists supported this stronger national government, the stronger federal government that the Constitution was created, they get called the Federalists because they were in support of stronger federal power. The Federalists tend to be a bit wealthier. That's not to say that there aren't wealthy people not on their side, but just generally speaking, these are a lot of just broad generalizations. They do tend to be wealthier. They tend to have more money. They tend to be business people. They tend to be bankers. They tend to be more concentrated in the Northeast. They tend to be more concentrated in cities and urban centers in the United States. And tend to that, which also explains why some of them tend to be wealthier. That's where some of the more money and more elitist interests were. And arguably, these are people that were very, very concerned about the economic distress that had been created by the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. And so these are people that hoped that a stronger national government would better protect the economy and therefore better protect their finances and better protect their economic holdings, which of course is sometimes used to criticize the Federalists, but that does explain why some of them saw a lot of significant problems with having a weak central government and wanted a stronger national government for a number of reasons. One of those hoping that it would mean a stronger economy. The Federalists are joined then, or not joined, but are opposed by obviously the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists obviously oppose the Constitution. They are against the Constitution and are going to go campaigning against it and are trying to whip up enough support to have the Constitution rejected. And the Anti-Federalists get that name mainly because they were against the Federalists. It's not really the best name in the world for them because they're not opposed to federalism. They're not opposed to the idea of a national government. Their issue is that this Constitution is too powerful, that the government created by this Constitution is too powerful. They are fearful that a strong national government is going to become tyrannical. They are fearful that a strong national government like this is going to overpower the states. They feel like this is taking away too much state power, that state governments are all but dissolved as a result of this. And they are certain that a powerful national government is dangerous, and that a powerful national government like this one is bound to abuse its power. And they don't think that the Constitution does enough to limit that Constitution. There's a lot of specific things or really rather vague things in the Constitution, places where it's quite ambiguous about what the government's power is. And they're very, very fearful of those kind of things. Overall, and again, this is generalizing very much, the Anti-Federalists tend to be a bit less wealthy. They tend to be more from the South. They tend to be more from the West. And not to say there weren't wealthy Anti-Federalists, but they are more likely going to be from the South, where that wealth is more tied up in land rather than cash. And these are people that are from areas, they fear that this new government is going to be run by the wealthy, that it's going to be run by those elitist interests that are going to put their money and that sort of thing first. And they're just certain that their voice, being smaller, being more rural, agrarian interests, that's going to be overruled in this whole new thing. So those are all kinds of problems with the Anti-Federalists. The other big problem, before I get to the Federalist Papers, actually, that I should say, super important, is that the Anti-Federalists' biggest problem, their biggest beef, their biggest complaint about the Constitution is the lack of a Bill of Rights. It does not contain, in its original form, a Bill of Rights. We've talked multiple times about a Bill of Rights. We know that the English had a Bill of Rights, and these are all people that at one time in their life were English. So having a Bill of Rights that specifically lists the rights of the people and promises specific things the government cannot infringe upon, like the right to a trial by jury or something along those lines. To them, that was crucial. And to them, it was really important. And their assumption that if you didn't spell that out, that governments would naturally abuse those rights. And most states obviously had Bill of Rights as well. So they find it incredibly suspicious and potentially dangerous that this Constitution did not contain a Bill of Rights. Now, the Federalists argue that it wasn't necessary, that there were enough safeguards in place that you didn't need to spell it out, but the Anti-Federalists are not satisfied with that argument. One of the things that the Federalists end up doing to get their point across, and they did this kind of in reaction to a specific event, but then it has significance far beyond that event. And that is one of the things that they do to campaign, to get their ideas out there, is they will publish, or a few notable Federalists are going to publish something called the Federalist Papers. Hamilton fans have heard of this. The Federalist Papers, this is a series of essays written and published by some of the prominent Federalists. And it was specifically written when the state of New York was having their ratification convention, because New York was one of these sort of pivotal moment sort of states. Like if they got New York, they would have the ones that they needed in order to secure ratification. And, New York being a large state, rather influential, it was their hope if they could get New York, that, they would sort of seal the deal. So that's what they were originally written in that circumstance of New York is having their ratification convention. And to gain support for the Constitution, some prominent Federalists started writing these essays and publishing these essays over a series of several months. The main authors of the Federalist Papers were James Madison, which makes sense. We know he is the father of the Constitution, so it stands to reason that he would be a Federalist in support of the Constitution, and probably no better expert at exactly what the Constitution means. So he writes many of the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, of course, is an author of the Federalist Papers as well. We're going to be seeing him quite a bit. He's a close ally of Madison right here at this time, and Hamilton believed very much in a powerful federal government, probably more even than Madison did. And he writes most of the Federalist Papers, more than any other authors. And the third author is John Jay. who will later go on to be a Supreme Court justice. He will write actually only 5, but still very important contribution to the Federalist Papers. So they write these papers, publish them anonymously, without their names attached, which was kind of the style of the day to do that, as well as trying to keep their names out of the paper. So they use pen names. And what they do in these Federalist Papers is they, bit by bit, piece by piece, analyze the Constitution. They explain it. They explain what it means. They explain why it was important. They explain why this is going to be a good government. They explain why, yes, this is a more powerful government, but here's how it's going to be limited. Here's how they talk about checks and balances. They talk about ways that the president is limited in their power. They talk about how this is, going to be a true republic. This is going to defend our ideals. They just take it apart bit by bit and explain why this was going to be a good government and why it should be supported. They answer back against some of the things that Anti-Federalists are saying, like the whole Bill of Rights thing. Madison argues that it just isn't necessary, that there's enough stuff here to limit the government's power that you don't need to spell out a specific list. Now, the Anti-Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalists do publish a series of papers as well, and we call those the Anti-Federalist Papers, but they are less organized. The Anti-Federalist Papers is more a collection of, this Anti-Federalist and that Anti-Federalist. They were all writing papers, but not in a coordinated way, not in an organized, intentional way. The Federalist Papers, this was planned out by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison. They each took parts that they were experts in, Madison concentrated mostly on the legislature. That's where he had most of his experience, so forth and so on. It was a project that they sat down and planned out beginning to end. The Anti-Federalist Papers was more random. So we tend to call them the Anti-Federalist Papers, but it wasn't an organized campaign the way that the Federalist Papers were. And the Federalist Papers were incredibly successful. They do get a lot of support for the Constitution, and then what they provide now is an exact bit-by-bit, play-by-play commentary on the Constitution, but from the very people that wrote it. So we have, this insight way longer than the Constitution ever thought about being, about the Constitution and what people like Madison and what people like Hamilton were thinking when they wrote it and why they wrote it a certain way. So it's a really valuable tool for us now to really understand what all of this was meant and what the intention was with this. Now, the Federalists obviously eventually do win. We know that we eventually get the Constitution fully ratified in 1789, and that is when it officially goes into effect. But some states do hold out. There was, that doesn't mean that they all approved it. So it's interesting to think that while the Constitution is oftentimes something that's quite uniting today and something that both sides of political arguments, really wrap themselves in, to say it's all about the Constitution, it wasn't a unifying thing at the time. And, they had to fight really, really hard to get it ratified. Some states held out even after it had gone into effect and didn't ratify it until they kind of saw it as no other choice. And also, the ratification of the Constitution, yes, there were those like Madison that felt this was, a very, very good form of government. But there's also the sense for some that this is the best we can do. So the Federalists do win this fight for ratification, but not so much because everybody thinks the Constitution is awesome. The Federalists really win, one, because they're wealthier, they have more money, they are better organized. They are more on the same page. The Federalists are far more united. The Constitution is good and the Constitution must be ratified. The Anti-Federalists are far more disorganized. We call them the Anti-Federalists, but they are only really united in the fact that they don't like the Constitution. They are all over the place when it comes to what they think needed to be done instead. And also the other big thing for the Anti-Federalists and why we could argue they lose, is they don't have an alternative. The Anti-Federalists are never able to offer another option. There's not a plan B, and they're not able to unite themselves around the other option. And so for some states, yes, there was this is a good idea, we love it, but there was also a sense for some is, well, we know the articles aren't working, and this is the best that we've got. And even Madison might have said that to an extent of, look, this is the best we can do. And, this is going to be okay, but, we can't make everybody happy, and this is the best attempt that we can do to satisfy everyone else. The other thing that does lead to the ratification of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists being defeated because they're not as well organized, they're not as well funded, and they have no other option. But the Federalists do also agree to somewhat of a compromise here. they agree that a Bill of Rights will be added. We were just talking about how the lack of a Bill of Rights was the Anti-Federalist biggest concern here. Madison thought that it was unnecessary, and also by the time you got to ratification was concerned about, well, now that we're in this process, we can't change it now. So the gentleman's agreement, meaning they don't ever write and sign something down, write it all and sign it and all that kind of stuff. But the agreement that is sort of made is that if we get the Constitution ratified, if enough folks will support it, we will add a Bill of Rights later. And they make good on that promise. And so once the Constitution goes into effect in 1789, Madison himself will lead the way in the very first Congress to propose what becomes the Bill of Rights, and that gets officially worked out and added within the next couple of years. The Bill of Rights, so that's added kind of as a compromise. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So the first 10 amendments that spell out specific rights to the people, or actually most of them spell out specific rights to the people, largely modeled and designed to resemble the English Bill of Rights and some of the Bill of Rights that each of the individual states had. Now, at no point in this class are you going to have to go down and name all 10 of those amendments and specifically list all of the rights that are included in all 10 of those amendments. I'm going to briefly run over what is in those, because you kind of need to know, generally speaking, what are some of the rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights as a whole, but you won't see from me specific, what is the Second Amendment, what is the Third Amendment, those kind of things. So I'm going to move myself over here and use this visual here to remind us. So again, just going through overall some of the general things that are promised in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, which is depicted right here, this is probably the one that's the most familiar to people. I bet if you walk down the hall or down the street or ask somebody in the store something about the First Amendment, they could probably tell you something, which is, I think, says a lot for this amendment of how important it is to a lot of people and kind of seen as one of those essential rights. Okay, this is, of course, the one that protects free speech, your right to protest, your right to say what you want. Freedom of religion is in here, as well as that includes the non-establishment clause that prevents the government from establishing any specific religion as being like an official religion, and also free exercise, that the government can't interfere with your right to exercise your religion. Freedom of the press, those kind of things. Now, of course, there's limitations, and this is not an easy concept to always understand. And we always argue about what exactly freedom of speech means and how far does that go. And, there are some things that are not protected by free speech, like obscenity and, threats and violence and stuff like that. Libel and slander, those things are not protected by the First Amendment. But and it's something, of course, we still struggle with and constantly argue with, but I think a foundational freedom for a lot of people, to be sure. The right to bear arms, of course, is the Second Amendment, the right to be able to defend yourself. Number 3 might seem a little weird to us now, but if we think about the context in which it was written, it makes more sense. And this is the whole that no quartering of troops, no quartering of soldiers. So the government can't ask you to house or pay for housing for soldiers during peacetime. Again, that one sounds weird to us, but if you think about these people and how that had been an issue with Britain in their lifetime, why they would want to make sure that that was spelled out in this Bill of Rights. Both 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 all have to do with rights of the accused, or really more 6 and 7. But anyway, going back to 4 here, let me stick with that. This is the one about searches and seizures. This is the, where probable cause and search warrants and all those kind of things come in, is in the Fourth Amendment. The rights of persons accused of crimes in number 5. This is the amendment that protects you from what's called self-incrimination, saying something that might make you look like you're guilty. This is what in the movies and on TV shows, when they arrest somebody and they say you have the right to remain silent. The Fifth Amendment doesn't literally say that, but the whole right to remain silent thing, the Miranda rights, is based in the Fifth Amendment. The idea that people had to be informed of what those Fifth Amendment rights were. Or you may hear sometimes in movies somebody's being questioned about something and they say, I plead the Fifth. They mean they don't want to say anything. That's invoking that right of, not incriminating themselves. So they don't have to say anything that could be used against them. 6 and 7 has to do with trials, the right to a trial, the right to a jury in a trial, a jury of your peers. We talked many times about how the right to a trial by jury was an essential right of English people that Americans very much wanted to defend. The Eighth Amendment is the one about excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. So that also deals with the rights of the people. Now, 9 and 10 are kind of the weird ones because they're often easily forgotten about because they either don't deal with a specific right. That's the case for 9. And 10 actually doesn't deal with rights to the people at all. This number 9 here, and where it says rights kept by the people, basically this is kind of the catch-all. The Ninth Amendment basically just says that your rights aren't limited to the things that are in 1 through 8. So it was important to Madison and several others, and one of their concerns about adding a Bill of Rights was if you say, okay, if we spell out that you have these rights, does that then imply that anything that we didn't say you don't have the right to? So that's why they included number 9 to basically say, yes, you have the rights that are in 1 through 8, but just because we didn't mention it or did not list it, it doesn't mean that you don't have that right. So it sort of encompasses other things that they might not have actually listed in 1 through 8. And 10 actually doesn't deal with rights to the people, but rights to the states. And you can see how this has a very anti-federalist appeasement kind of thing in it. It basically says that any powers not granted to the national government, anything the Constitution doesn't specifically assign to the national government, are reserved to the states or the people. And that's interesting because for a number of reasons. One, you can see how that's meant to calm down the Anti-Federalists that worried that this was taking away too much power from the states and that it was going to abuse that power. But this is also interesting because you can make the case that this conflicts with another part of the Constitution that we'll talk about in the next section called the Supremacy Clause. So we're setting ourselves up for continuing disputes about who's really in charge. Is it the federal government or is it states? One over another one? Those kind of things. So we'll continue to look at that. So a Bill of Rights is added a few years after the Constitution is written and goes into effect officially in 1789. Of course, there's lots of arguments still to be had, and we will look a little bit more in the final part of this at the kind of powers that it sets up, the functions of the 3 different branches of government, how it's organized, and just a little bit more about the government overall. So we will talk about that next time.